I'm Rob Heathman from Fusion Pharma, and I'm going to be providing you with an overview of the UK Clinical Trials Regulations 2025. And this is to help sponsors to prepare for what's been publicised as the most significant regulatory transformation of UK clinical trials in 20 years. Given that it's the 5th of November, hopefully the presentation will help spark some ideas, thoughts in your planning for these. Don't worry, there won't be too many of those. Okay, so by way of further introduction, I'm a senior clinical regulatory affairs consultant at Fusion Pharma. I've been around for a while, longer than that picture might suggest, and I have over 25 years experience in industry. I started my career in the research lab before moving into support for drug development and commercialization programs, and latterly focusing on clinical regulatory affairs. I've got an extensive range of clinical experience across global studies, spanning multiple therapeutic areas and investigational products, and I'm a EU, UK clinical submission subject matter expert, and clearly that is inclusive of EU CTR, the Clinical Trials Information System, and obviously UK CTR as well. This webinar is part of Fusion's strong commitment to our community. If not already, do follow our regular updates on our website, through LinkedIn and via our newsletters. And if after this webinar you'd like to reach out to me at all, please feel free to do so using the details provided here. Okay, so to the agenda, I will start by providing a bit of brief background behind the latest CTR amendments, including an update on the implementation timeline, before running through a number of the key important areas covered in the amendments. Now, these are including, but not limited to, combined review, notifiable trials, modification updates, ending of a trial, transparency considerations, label updates, non-investigational medicinal products, safety and PV considerations, participant protection and consent, and I'll wrap up with a summary and a run through of some key next steps before taking a Q&A. As a reminder, everyone attending will receive a link to a recording of the webinar, a copy of the presentation slides, and a list of the Q&A from the session. Do ask questions in the chat. I'll answer what I can at the end of the presentation. Any questions that require any further thought, or if we've run out of time, we will collate and send out following the webinar, and we'll aim to have that with you before the end of the week. Right, so this slide shows a brief history of the UK Clinical Trials Regulations since 2001. The EU Clinical Trials Directive 2001/20 EC was adopted in 2001, and member states were required to implement it by May 1st, 2004. The UK implemented this through the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulations 2004. Combined ways of working was piloted from March 2018, streamlining the approval process by combining MHRA and the Research Ethics Committee reviews. Not shown here, but Brexit-related amendments featured in 2019, where EU references were removed and they were prepared for regulatory independence. From 1st of January 2021, the UK operated a fully sovereign clinical trial system. Combined review became mandatory in January 2022, while the EU implemented its new clinical trial regulation, 536/2014, and also the MHRA conducted a public consultation on comprehensive reforms in early 2022, leading to the new UK regulations being signed into law on April the 11th, 2025, and will come into force on April the 28th, 2026. Okay, so that's a bit of history. Now looking forward, the timeline for the implementation of the regulation amendments are shown on this slide. So as I said, 11th of April 2025, the regulations were signed into law and the implementation period officially began. Note that there's a slight discrepancy with the regulations being signed into law and the implementation date, because the clinical trial statutory instrument needed to be re-signed on the 28th of April 2025 due to a technical issue with the final processing of that statutory instrument. Between May and December 2025, the MHRA and HRA have published comprehensive guidance documents. These were first published in June. Updates have been provided so far in August and October. Further updates are possible until go live. These aren't expected to be substantial, rather minor refinements. Throughout this period, there have been industry training programs, there's been stakeholder engagement activities from the MHRA and the REC to refine and update that guidance. And sponsors really should be undertaking or certainly planning for the implementation of these changes through system preparation, through electronic upgrades, through SOP, work instruction updates, and staff training programs. Between January and April 2026, really that's the final preparation phase, and focus should be on systems testing, validation, preparing for go live. And as mentioned, on the 28th of April 2026, the new regulations come into full force across the UK. It is important to note that during the transition period, applications submitted before the 28th of April 2026 are subject to the old rules, and applications submitted after the 28th of April 2026 are subject to the new rules. This does also apply to amendments / modification submissions as well as initial applications. Okay, combined review. So whilst the combined review procedure really is old news to a certain extent, having been mandatory for UK submissions since 2022, the amended regulations do formalise the process of a single application being submitted via IRAS for parallel review by the MHRA and the REC simultaneously, leading to joint information requests, which in theory at least lead to no conflicting requests that are coordinated in coordinated timelines which are set in legislation, leading to a single UK decision. Now, the main update concerning combined review in the amended regulations is the change to the timelines. So following a 7-day validation process, combined decisions on standard initial applications will be issued within 30 days. A significant change is that if RFIs are issued following review, which would normally be the case, applicants will now have 60 days to respond unless an extension is agreed. Now, this allows considerably more time than the current 14 days for sponsors to prepare a high quality response. A final combined MHRA EC decision will be available within 10 days following receipt of the response. Timelines are extended where consultation with committees and specialist groups are required. The application review is extended from 30 days to 120 days. And the decision timeframe is extended from 10 days to 40 days. And if an ATMP is involved, that decision time is extended to 70 days. So the total timeline for standard applications could be up to 107 days. It is almost certain, however, that that will be significantly shorter, as this includes the full 60-day response timeframe, which is expected to be reduced in most cases. Another key change within the amended regulations is the introduction of notifiable trials for certain clinical studies, and these provide expedited automatic approval for eligible trials via a 14-day versus a 30-day review period. Note that it is only the MHRA's part of the combined review that is classified as a notifiable trial, and therefore can receive automatic authorization within the 14 days. The EC still reviews notifiable trials through the same process as non-notifiable trials. The scheme applies to initial applications that satisfy a variety of criteria. There's inclusion criteria, there's exclusion criteria, and there's also some additional criteria as well. So trials must either involve authorized IMPs that are used in accordance with that authorization and be unmodified, or have received the previous UK CTA approval of each IMP within the last 2 years, or the trial is already approved in the US, the EU, or an EEA country. Now, in addition to that, the trial must not have any ongoing significant safety concerns, have any known or suspected impurity-related concerns in healthy volunteer trials, include any first-in-human data that's not been assessed or approved, involve any higher dose levels than existing trials, have a first-in-human trial population that's not generalizable to the proposed trial population, include any minor pregnant or breastfeeding participants, include any IMPs that are first-in-human or ATMPs, and as I mentioned, be a modification submission. This only applies to initial applications. The expedited automatic approval timelines for notifiable trials follows, again, a 7-day validation period, a 14-day review, where the MHRA notifies applicants of an automatic authorization, and 16 days for the combined decision following the EC review. So the overall timeframe for the MHRA EC combined decision for notifiable trials will be issued within 30 days of validation. It's not clear that whether the EC will still raise RFIs for notifiable trials. Given the timelines, I think this is very unlikely, however. And the MHRA are expecting that approximately 20% of all UK clinical trials are expected to qualify for the notifiable trial fast track process. Okay, so moving on to modifications. In my mind, one of the most significant updates in the amended regulations is around amendments, stroke modifications. So amendments are now termed modifications. This is in line with the terminology under the EU CTR, and modifications are recategorized in line with a more risk proportionate approach. So substantial modifications now consist of Route A substantial modifications and Route B substantial modifications. So Route A are complex changes that require full review, and Route B are lower risk modifications that are able to be submitted for automatic approval. Non-substantial modifications now consist of modifications of an important detail and minor modifications. So modifications of an important detail are changes that are notified to the authority for oversight purposes. These have no impact on patient safety, and examples might include changes to the trial identification, changes to contact details for the sponsor, investigators, legal representatives, or changes to the trial duration. Minor modifications are administrative changes that are not required to be submitted for review and can be implemented at any time. And examples of those might include changes to site participant numbers, record keeping processes, protocol clarification letters, format changes to reference safety information, or IB errata. As I mentioned earlier, applicable regulations are determined by the date of the modification submission, not whether the trial is an old rules or new rules trial. So a modification submission made prior to the 28th of April 2026 will be considered under the old regulations, and modification submissions after the 28th of April 2026 will be considered under the new regulations, even if that trial is an old rules trial. Okay, so a bit more detail on substantial modification structure. So Route A modifications, as I said, concern complex changes that are likely to have significant substantial impact on the safety or rights of the participants, or on the reliability or robustness of the data generated in the trial. That requires full review. So examples might include changes to trial endpoints, changes to IMPs, changes to dosing levels, any new safety data, reference safety information updates, monitoring procedure changes, or updates to labeling. Where an application for a Route B substantial modification is incorrectly submitted as a Route A substantial modification, the application is likely to be invalidated and will need to be resubmitted correctly as a Route B substantial modification. And this is because the necessary documents won't be present with the Route A package. There is a significant change to the substantial modification process for Route A modifications from what occurs currently. Again, following a 7-day validation process, combined decisions will be issued within 35 days. However, the process now includes the possibility for RFIs. These were unlikely to be issued previously. The application would likely be rejected. If RFIs are issued following review, as for initial applications under the amended regulations, the applicant will have 60 days to respond unless an extension is agreed. And a final combined MHRA EC decision will be available within 10 days following receipt of that response. So the total timeline for Route A substantial modifications could be up to 112 days. Again, as for initial applications, it's almost certain that it will be significantly shorter because this is inclusive of the full 60-day response time frame. Okay, so this slide focuses on Route B substantial modifications, which concern lower risk modifications, i.e. those that have no new significant safety concerns. Submissions under this route must be in line with the MHRA Route B substantial modification guidance, i.e. not be a first-in-human trial and have been reviewed and approved as part of a substantial amendment or modification in the EU, EEA or US, and that they are included on the limited list of specific allowable protocol or IBS-MPC changes. There's a link there, but examples are include a change to the primary objective, new endpoint measurements, change to the end of trial definition, changes to allowable concomitant medications, additional toxicological or pharmacological data with no safety changes, or increased SAE frequencies in the RSI. So Route B substantial modifications are subject to automatic approval, and unlike previously, if Route A substantial modifications are submitted incorrectly as Route B substantial modifications, they will be rerouted through the Route A process. Now, the expedited automatic approval timelines for Route B substantial modifications follows again a 7-day validation period, a 14-day review where the MHRA will notify applicants of an automatic authorization, and 21 days for the combined decision following the EC review. So the initial MHRA EC combined decision will be issued within 35 days of validation. Again, it's not clear whether the EC will raise RFIs for these Route B substantial modifications, but given the timelines, again, I think it's unlikely. And the MHRA have opened a Route B substantial modification pilot exercise to test the process, and this is now open and will run from the 1st of October 2025 to 31st of March next year. A registration form is required to be completed in order to participate, and the automatic approval won't apply to the pilot. Instead, the MHRA will contact sponsors within 14 days to confirm approval or to inform that a full assessment will be undertaken. There is updated guidance on the process for ending a trial. With respect to the notification timelines and the process, the sponsor must provide written notice to the MHRA and the EC that the clinical trial is ended. This refers to the global end of trial. Local end of trial declarations can be submitted optionally, but they won't be reviewed. And any relevant safety updates and substantial modifications must continue until the global end of trial notification is submitted, unless that's been previously agreed via a separate substantial modification submission. That end of trial notice must be provided within 90 days where the trial ends in accordance with the protocol, or 15 days where the trial is terminated prior to that stated in the protocol. Following submission, an acknowledgement will be issued. No acknowledgement will of course be issued if the notification refers to the local end of trial And the results publication details should be provided, and I'll touch on this in a bit more detail on the next slide. Trials can now lapse. So a trial approval will now lapse after 2 years from the date in which the trial was approved, if no participants have been recruited to take part in the UK. This does only apply to applications submitted after the 28th of April 2026. Should the approval lapse, the sponsors will be contacted via email to confirm, and then the sponsor would need to submit an end of trial notification. Extension requests are possible, and sponsors can apply for those. The authorities are able to grant an initial extension of up to 36 months or a further extension of up to 24 months. So a key driver behind the amended regulations is the enhanced sponsor obligations for transparency and accountability. And as part of this, there are registration requirements. So trials must be registered on a public registry, and that must be either a primary or partner registry or a data provider to the WHO International Clinical Trials Registry platform. And that must happen either on the date in which the first participant is recruited or 90 days after the date of approval, whichever is earlier. And that requirement is for all active trials as of the 28th of April 2026, irrespective of submission date. Summary of results are required to be published on the same public platform within 12 months of the trial ending. Again, that's applicable to all active trials as of the 28th of April 2026. Participant communication. It will be a regulatory requirement to offer to share a lay summary of trial results with participants within 12 months of the trial ending, and that is only applicable to new trials. Sponsors are able to apply for deferrals or waivers to the registration requirements and the results publication requirements, explaining why that's needed. And that can be requested at any point before the deadline for registering the trial or before the 12-month deadline for posting results. Phase 1 trials, for example, may be eligible for a deferral of up to 30 months from the conclusion of the trial, provided that minimum information has been registered in a public registry in the required time frame. And lastly, on here, there are updated archive requirements. So the regulations now impose a 25-year archive requirement as opposed to the previous 5-year retention requirement. This is applicable to new trials only, but could potentially impact documents such as contracts and patient documentation, such as ICFs. Okay, labelling. There's new, extensive, detailed guidance for clinical trial labelling. This applies to both old and new trials, and I think this is very helpful in comparison to what was available previously. So there are now explicit labelling requirements for IMPs that are not authorised in the UK, EU, or ICH country. There are detailed requirements for IMPs that are authorised in the UK, including those that are exclusively administered on site or for radiopharmaceuticals. Under this, there is now a requirement for abbreviated labels to include the term for clinical trial use only. There's requirements listed for IMPs that are not authorised in the UK but are authorised in the EU or ICH region, as well as requirements for small primary container labels and non-investigational medicinal product labels. Sponsors are able to request exemptions or variations to the labelling requirements, and these can be submitted with a justification together with the labelling documents included in the application. An example of this might be to omit their keep out of reach of children statement for products that are exclusively administered at the site. And the transitional arrangements for labelling updates. IMPs manufactured before the 28th of April 2026 can continue to be used with existing labels. However, IMPs manufactured after the 28th of April 2026 must be labelled according to the amended label requirements. And any label updates would need to be submitted and approved prior to use. So non-investigational medicinal products, these are now defined under the regulation, and these are defined as a medicinal product used or to be used in a clinical trial as described in the protocol, but not as an investigational medicinal product. This is now aligned with the EU CTR definition of an auxiliary medicinal product. Similarly, NIMPs should hold marketing authorizations wherever possible. Sponsors are able to potentially use unauthorized NIMPs with a clear justification. An example might be where there's issue with supply or availability of the authorized product. Examples of NIMPs might be rescue medications. So these are NIMPs that are identified in the protocol that may be administered to patient when the IMP doesn't have satisfactory efficacy or the effect of the IMP is too great and is likely to cause an adverse reaction or to manage an emergency situation. NIMPs could be challenge agents, which are given to participants to produce a physiological response before the pharmacological action of the IMP can be assessed. Or NIMPs could be given to participants as a tool to assess relevant trial endpoints where that product is not being used as a test or as a reference product. And NIMPs could also be background treatments, which are administered to participants regardless of randomization group, either to treat the study indication or standard of care. There are some specific requirements associated with NIMPs included in the guidance, and clearly there are compliance requirements aligned with GMP, so the provision of valid MIAs and QP declarations where applicable. There are specific labelling requirements, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, and there are also safety reporting requirements for adverse events related to NIMPs and also guidance on the inclusion of SAEs that are suspected to be related to NIMP in DSURs. So on safety, the amended regulations do introduce significant changes to safety reporting requirements and pharmacovigilance. They reflect risk proportionate changes to safety reporting whilst maintaining robust oversight. So suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions and developmental safety update reports now only need to be reported to the MHRA, and the MHRA will liaise with the EC if necessary. There's clear guidance on DSUR content, and that's to be submitted within 60 days of data lock. And protocols specified SUSARs that don't require immediate reporting can follow timelines that are outlined in the protocol, and the urgent safety measure reporting period is extended to 7 days from 3 days. Under pharmacovigilance, serious adverse reactions, serious adverse event lists are no longer required to be included in DSURs. Sponsors must now include an appropriate discussion on how safety concerns have been evaluated and interpreted. Note that MHRA may still ask for a list of adverse reactions and adverse events that have occurred at any time during the reporting year to be provided within a 30-day time frame following a DSUR review, or if any safety events have been raised. Transitional arrangements for pharmacovigilance. So by default, the amended regulations will apply to old rules trials from the 28th of April 2026. However, sponsors of old rules trials may request to temporarily continue the trial under old PV regulations within 60 days of the 28th of April, or when making an earlier submission under the old PV rules. So that means the old PV regulations can be followed until the first submission of the first annual safety report after the 28th of April, and thereafter the amended regulations must be followed. And clearly for new clinical trials, the amended regulations apply. The amended regulations provide opportunities for updated consent frameworks, enhanced protection for vulnerable populations, and improved approaches to inclusion and diversity. So under modernised consent frameworks, the regulations encourage the use of electronic consent technologies whilst maintaining rigorous standards for consent validity and participant understanding. The regulations also offer sponsors of trials that meet certain conditions the option to use simplified arrangements for seeking and evidencing informed consent. Specific details are yet to be confirmed on this, though, by the HRA. There are enhanced protections for vulnerable populations, including incapacitated adults and minors, such as specific requirements for consent processes and legal representation, and specific provisions for emergency settings, such as recruitment without prior consent. And lastly, there are enhanced requirements for the presence of inclusion and diversity plans to help ensure clinical research includes people who could benefit from the findings and focus on addressing an underrepresentation of certain populations that have traditionally been underserved by clinical trials. Okay, I recognise that's been a very quick run through and contained a lot of information. So just to quickly summarise and outline some some key next steps. So I've outlined the main updates that I see that are contained within the amended UK clinical trials regulations, and as I hope you will have gained from that, it does indeed constitute a major overhaul of the clinical trial regulations. And I think those updates can be covered categorized in three main areas, though inevitably there will be a degree of overlap. But firstly, there are strategic opportunities for UK trial sponsors, which is really the driver behind the revamp. But these include accelerated startup timelines, the fast track notification scheme, efficiencies gained from the single application process, risk-based optimizations, and streamlined modification options that are now available or will now be available. There are patient-centric improvements, including modernized approaches to consent, enhanced transparency requirements, and an increase on diversity and representation, and also safety optimization with a risk proportionate oversight. And clearly there are enhanced sponsor obligations as well, such as transparency and accountability requirements, labeling updates, and new safety reporting requirements. So early adopters who implement these changes will gain significant competitive advantages. As I said, through faster study startup, a reduced regulatory burden, and enhanced operational efficiencies. I should reiterate that the topics that I presented today summarize the key points of interest, that there is more detail, there are other areas for consideration, and there will be further guidance updates issued. There are expected to be, as an example, updates to changes in definitions in December. There's clearer guidance on GCP requirements in January, and updates to the process for modifications of important details in March. So there is more information that will need to be absorbed and considered as part of this. MHRA issued a blog last week. There's less than 6 months to go until go live. So sponsors should, if not already, begin implementation planning immediately. That needs to focus on systems. It needs to focus on processes, training, stakeholder engagement, holistic pathway evaluation during the remainder of that transition period. Fusion can help. We can help with providing support with this, or all sponsors are encouraged to perform a full assessment of updates and impacts on your internal processes and procedures for ongoing and future clinical trials. But do get in touch if you would like any help with any of this. We'd be happy to support. So ultimately, organizations that embrace this transformation will be much better positioned than those that delay or resist those changes. And it needn't lead to an explosive outcome with the right preparation. So that was all I had to say. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your attention. I hope you found it useful. I don't think we've got any questions that I can see. Claire, has anything come in?